Okay, so our final video here in the language chapter, so a big part of this culture unit, is to look at language diversity. So how can countries embrace more than one language in the age of globalization, but also looking at the revival and the struggles that other languages are having to keep themselves going as well. So some of that stuff is just going to be in the book, and then some we're going to mention in here as well. So kind of starting ourselves. So we've kind of looked at, the differences between like an official and a standard language, and then also we mentioned this very early on in that first video. What's the difference between a monolingual and multilingual state? Mono meaning one, multi meaning more than one. All right, so that should hopefully, be the key factor there. So I really like this definition in the older edition of our textbook, the 11th edition, we use the 12th, is the distribution of a language is a measure of the of the measure of the fate of a cultural group. And so much of culture is tied into the language. I know I'm kind of using these questions here, and we'll do this if we ever come to it in class, but if you're gone, this is where we're going to mention it here, is that, language is really important to survival of full culture because it holds traditions, it holds the way people communicate with one another, it holds, history, and it gives you an essence of, kind of uniqueness and individuality and a kind of way to uniquely carry yourself in the world. And so, if a culture loses its language, it loses a very large part of itself. And a lot of that, again, we'll revisit here and then, adding in a few other places as well. And so, threaten the usage and survival of folk cultures or folk languages we're going to, again, break into. And then, again, the book in particular talks about how we can sustain and preserve the usage and survival of folk languages. But, there's a lot of threats to them that we'll talk about. So, globalization both harms and helps in the preservation of folk languages in the sense that, because of globalization, we're all speaking more of the same languages, or at least have the ability to learn more languages because it's more frequent and more fluent. But at the same time, that pushes out, pop culture, or not pop culture, but more of those standard languages, those lingua francas like English, French, Spanish, Mandarin, German. And at the same time, it also, preserves folk culture because we can hold on to that stuff. As a result, we can hold on to people who practice and speak a certain language, and you can kind of, learn from the leaders and from the people who are really, really good, the masters of a language, and they can kind of record that history, the sounds, how things are pronounced, and that can be preserved through, recordings and through videos. So, there is that benefit to globalization and the increase of technology. But you have to get to those leaders and those people that are willing to share that before a language goes extinct and the last speakers, pass on without passing on the actual language itself. So globalization can both protect and it can also, essentially limit folk language as well. So we talked about this a little bit, the definition of a multilingual state before, are countries that have more than one official or often used language. So again, not necessarily official language, but it could also be more than one standard language. Right, so, a lot of countries, or almost no country on the planet, still uses just one language, right? Every country has multiple speakers of various languages, but this is talking about the major main languages within a given country. So again, India fits this, the United States fits this, to an extent, Canada, and a number of others. So, our examples here are Belgium and Switzerland that we're going to use here in Europe, are both multilingual and are on the border between Romance and Germanic branches between themselves. All right, you can think of other ones that we've talked about as well, in terms of like Nigeria that we're going to, we haven't talked about Nigeria. We're going to mention that here in the video as well. So here is a picture of Belgium, all right? So in the northern part, so Belgium being right down here where I have the arrow, okay, right in between France, Germany, and to the north is the Netherlands. So in the northern part of Belgium is the predominantly Dutch language area, so that's where they speak Dutch. In the bottom half of the country is the French language area. Excuse me for the yawn. So especially the country is split predominantly between those sections, and then right off here onto the far eastern side is the German language area. So there is no Belgian language, it is people who speak French, Dutch, and German, or at least parts of those. And then the capital, Brussels, is bilingual, so it speaks multiple languages. So Belgium has two different official languages that divide the country. As we said, the Dutch half in the northern part, and then the French in the bottom. And so the technical term is the Walloons, right, that speak it in the southern part, and then Flemish being in the northern part. So a connection to the Dutch language, not necessarily Dutch itself, and then not necessarily French, but an offshoot of French within Walloon. right? And so, and this goes back more to Belgium's history, also talking about, how you keep a divided country together, is the fact that each group controls its own internal affairs in its own area. Did not mean to do that. We'll come up to Switzerland here in a sec. But essentially, each group concerns its own internal affairs because at one point, the Walloons in the southern part dominated the part of the northern half where the Flemish speakers were. And now they've divided the country essentially into two halves where both languages are official, but again, this is the official language in the top half of the country, this is the language that's official in the bottom half, to keep them both happy. And so the middle, where we see the capital of Brussels kind of right above that dividing line, is bilingual to, again, sort of unite them. And so they use language as both a dividing force and as a uniting force. And we'll come up to those terms within the ethnicity chapter of centripetal and centrifugal to talk about things that unite and divide countries. And so for them, having their own languages makes them feel special, makes them feel still a part of the country. But there is a dividing line based on those ethnic parts, and language is a connection to that, right? So Switzerland is a much more unique way in terms of how to peacefully handle multiple languages, because Switzerland has four main languages. It has German, Italian, French, and Romansh, and so there's a lot of cultural diversity. Because the local government, so each little state or region within Switzerland has a lot of power, and no one group or party dominates at the national stage, so thus no one language dominates at the national stage. So that way they're all happily able to, even while they speak different languages, Switzerland is more united than, Belgium, which actually has a very clear division between its peoples related to both ethnicity, but also to the language piece, right? Here they're more likely to, all speak, the different parts of the language, I think German and French being the biggest ones, but essentially it comes down to the fact that no one group dominates at any certain level beyond the local piece that allows for a more understanding and peaceful coexistence within the country itself. All right, so panning out to Nigeria, so we go now switching into sub-Saharan Africa, right along the coastline with the Atlantic Ocean. Nigeria is one of the most heavily populated countries. I believe if it's not the most heavily populated, it's number 2 behind Egypt, inside of Africa. And Nigeria itself has over 500 distinct languages as a result of having all these different ethnic groups that we'll revisit this again in a few chapters, but essentially it was the reason Nigeria exists as it is because of colonialism. The British kind of took over the territory and sort of said this is our dividing line, and threw in a bunch of different ethnic groups, over 500, as a result. And so there's over 500 distinct languages that exist inside of it. And so Nigeria has only 3 languages that are spoken by at least 1/8 of the people. I mean, that's not a very large number. When you talk about all of these different groups. And so a lot of it comes back to the 3 dominant ethnic groups. The Hausa here in the northern half of the country, the Yoruba, and the Igbo, right, are essentially the 3 groups that dominate Nigeria. And mind you can see not just Nigeria on this map, but also Cameroon and Benin as well. But yeah, and so that can be very difficult in terms of, you have all these different people that do not speak the same language. And how do you communicate with that? And so that's why when you have too much cultural or language diversity, it's often hard to get groups to work together and to sort of, have any one group or person in control, because you're having these constant fightings, especially between those 3 powers with the Hausa, Igbo, and Yoruba, and then you also get other little groups that are also fighting as well. So the chance of knowing one language of another's is very, very unlikely in various parts of the country. So someone speaking, in the Yoruba areas, knowing languages from the Hausa, it's very unlikely, especially with all the distinct languages that exist within there, right? So English is the official language because it's kind of the middle ground, it being a former British colony, and that essentially is kind of that lingua franca because everyone was at one point supposed to know this, and not everyone does, but it's again a connection to something that is easier for people to learn in the sense of, instead of learning 500 different languages or dozens of different languages, to have everyone learn English, or at least to an extent of English, and being able to connect that way and to try and bring the country together. All right, again, as a lasting result of, those, colonial powers. So when we talk about isolated languages, so again, connecting ourselves to that diversity piece, is a language unrelated to any other language and not attached to any one language family. All right, and essentially that means that they have almost no interaction with speakers of other languages for their language to become so independent. So the Basque people in this part of Spain and France, right around the Pyrenees Mountains, are essentially very, very different because of the fact that, you know, they were cut off from the other Latin-speaking peoples. And so Basque essentially is not at all connected to the Latin languages. It's not connected at all to a lot of those other Indo-Europeans. So because of that isolation, they were able to sort of develop it on their own. This is different from Iceland, all right, because the Icelandic language, all right, is more unchanged due to the fact that it was isolated. So they had ancestors that were German tribesmen, or Germanic being the better term of that. Think about Germany and Scandinavia. And so there was a connection to those people, and then they were kind of left on their own, but the language remained unchanged as a result. But however, that's not the same because there was that connection because of the movement of those peoples. The Basque people, there is no connection to those other languages because the language developed on its own, completely independent of any other group. All right, while the Icelandic one has a starting point within the Germanic languages, and then, you know, got more evolved because of that isolation, and so they developed their own words and things like that. The things that we've mentioned in the other pieces related to like dialect and accents, right? So here's our definition of extinct languages, all right, playing in again with diversity. And so languages once in use but are no longer spoken or read in daily activities. And so we talk about the extinct languages that, you know, no longer exist, but we also think about near extinct languages, or ones that are going extinct. And this unfortunately applies to a lot of the American Indian languages here in the United States and also in Canada as a result because of integration, being forced into the dominant culture, which the United States has a very bad history of that with the American Indians going back to essentially the 1800s. We can also talk about before then. Constant warfare, so that again going back to the beginning of colonization through about 1890, and then disease that was brought in again by European settlers. And so, we've looked at the map before about where the tribes used to be located, and then we looked at the reservation map. But yeah, so this is 20 years old now, but Native American language speakers, where does at least 5% of population 5 years and older speak the language of their home by the county, or their indigenous groups. And so the highest level areas are in South Dakota, Arizona, and kind of like in the Four Corners, where you have a lot of reservations, and then also within Alaska. But again, you look even Minnesota, we have a very large population, or at least one of the larger populations of Ojibwe Dakota peoples, and there's just not a whole lot of the language being passed on. And a lot of that was because when you talk about, the movement onto the reservations, and then, boarding schools where American Indian children were essentially sent to white schools where they were taught not to practice their language or their culture and were punished for doing so. There's that loss of culture. And so that talks about why languages and why culture can be threatened by popular cultures when that is repressed. Now, the United States no longer does this, but again, when you take, several generations out of that and essentially try to cut them off from their culture and try to make them not like their own culture, it is very damaging and long lasting. So much so that there's, very few speakers within each community or certain communities, and so it becomes more harder to preserve those languages. And then we talk about the revived languages and the preservation piece. So the preservation piece, again, is something more within the book, and then there's also another reading or two that I've kind of put in with Schoology. And then we get revived languages, so once extinct languages that are now used in daily activities. So within this, it's a pretty basic definition, but we use Hebrew because Hebrew was, the language of the Old Testament. Jews didn't really speak it outside of prayers. And so they spoke Aramaic, or they would speak languages of the other groups that they were in, like Russian or German, Arabic, Spanish, things like that. And so the Hebrew language was just a prayer language. It's the stuff that was in there. But then when the State of Israel was created in 1948, they made Hebrew the national language, or the official language. And people were coming into Israel as migrants and refugees as a result of World War II and before then, and to help unite the Jewish population. So now they had to come up with about 2,000 plus years of new words for all the new technology. So things like internet, grocery stores, cars, airplanes, computers, phones. And this applies to any other language that's also being revived. You have to add in all of these other vocabulary terms. So, and then we get this basic creation of new languages, some pop culture, some more based in need.